Early in the morning, in a quiet park, a simple act of kindness turns into something much bigger. What starts as a routine cleanup quickly takes a dangerous turn when unexpected visitors arrive. But they don't know who they're dealing with. How far will injustice go before someone stands up? And when that moment comes, will one person be enough to change everything? Watch till the end to see how it all unfolds. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you believe in standing up for what's right. The sun was only beginning to rise, casting a soft golden glow across the park. A thin mist clung to the grass, and the early morning air was crisp and refreshing. Birds chirped in the trees, their melodies blending with the distant hum of a city slowly waking up. The paths were mostly empty, except for the occasional jogger or dog walker. The tranquility of the scene was something John Cena appreciated. It was why he chose to run at this hour, before the chaos of the day fully took over. Dressed in a dark blue tank top and black running shorts, he jogged steadily along the paved trail, his breath controlled, his muscles relaxed yet alert. Running had always been more than just exercise for him. It was a way to clear his mind, to prepare for whatever challenges the day might bring. The rhythmic pounding of his feet against the ground was meditative, each step a reminder of discipline and endurance. As he approached a bend in the path, he slowed down slightly, noticing a group of people gathered near a bench. They weren't just standing around. They were busy collecting trash, stuffing it into large black garbage bags. Some of them wore gloves, others carried tools to pick up smaller pieces of litter. It wasn't something one typically saw this early in the morning, and it piqued his curiosity. John wiped the sweat from his forehead and jogged closer, observing their actions. The group consisted of men and women of different ages and backgrounds, all focused on their task. They worked efficiently, chatting quietly among themselves as they picked up plastic bottles, discarded fast food wrappers, and cigarette butts scattered along the walking trail. It was clear they weren't doing this for money or recognition. This was something they did out of a sense of duty. His eyes fell on a young woman seated in a wheelchair. She had dark, curly hair pulled back into a ponytail, and her expression was one of quiet determination. A pair of work gloves covered her hands as she maneuvered her wheelchair with practiced ease, using a grabber tool to pick up trash and drop it into the bag hanging on the side of her chair. She was completely immersed in her work, not letting her disability slow her down. John stepped forward, clearing his throat slightly to announce his presence. "Morning. What are you all doing out here so early?" The young woman looked up at him and smiled. Her eyes were warm, filled with a mix of amusement and confidence. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying a steady, self-assured tone. "We're volunteers. We clean the park every few days to keep it nice for everyone. People leave a lot of trash behind, and if we don't pick it up, no one will." John glanced at the bags already filled with garbage. They had clearly been at it for a while. He nodded approvingly. "That's a great thing you're doing," he said sincerely. "Can I help?" Her eyebrows lifted slightly in surprise before she grinned. "Of course. The more hands, the better." She reached into a nearby box and pulled out a pair of gloves, handing them to him. "I'm Lisa, by the way." "John," he replied, slipping on the gloves. Lisa chuckled. "Yeah, I know who you are. Everybody does." John smirked but said nothing. He took a garbage bag from another volunteer and got to work. As he bent down to pick up a crumpled soda can, he couldn't help but feel a deep respect for Lisa and the rest of the volunteers. They weren't doing this for praise or reward. They simply cared about their community enough to take action. That kind of selflessness was rare, and he admired it. For the next half hour, John worked alongside them, chatting occasionally as they made their way through the park. He learned that Lisa had been volunteering for years, ever since she was a teenager. She had always believed that small acts of kindness could make a big difference. "There's something satisfying about seeing a place go from filthy to clean," she said, tossing a plastic bottle into her bag. "It's like proof that effort matters." John nodded. "I get that. A lot of people complain about problems but don't do anything to fix them." "Exactly," she agreed. They continued working, the pile of trash steadily growing. The park was already looking better, and John felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. It wasn't the most glamorous thing he'd ever done, but it felt right. Then a deep, rumbling noise broke the peaceful morning. John looked up, frowning slightly as the sound grew louder. Motorcycles. Multiple engines revved aggressively, breaking the calm atmosphere like a sudden storm. Lisa stiffened slightly in her wheelchair, her fingers tightening around the handles of the grabber tool. John noticed how the other volunteers exchanged uneasy glances. "Let me guess," he said, turning to Lisa. "That's not a good sign." She exhaled slowly, her expression unreadable. "No, it's not." John followed her gaze toward the entrance of the park, where a group of 5 bikers rode in, their engines roaring like growling beasts. They were dressed in dark leather jackets, their faces partially obscured by sunglasses and thick beards. There was something deliberately menacing about the way they moved, as if they owned the place. The lead biker, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a bald head and a deep scar running down his cheek, cut the engine of his motorcycle and surveyed the volunteers with a smirk. John didn't like the way the man's eyes lingered on Lisa. The other bikers parked their motorcycles and dismounted, their heavy boots crunching against the pavement. They moved with a lazy confidence, as if they had done this before. Lisa let out a slow breath and muttered under her breath, "Here we go again." John's gaze hardened. He had a feeling his morning run had just turned into something much more serious. The roar of the motorcycles slowly faded as the bikers dismounted, their presence immediately shifting the atmosphere in the park. The once peaceful air was now thick with tension. John Cena stood still, watching the men as they sauntered toward the group of volunteers. There was an undeniable arrogance in their movements, the kind that came from people who had been unchecked for too long. Lisa adjusted her gloves and exhaled softly. John noticed that her fingers twitched slightly around the grabber tool. She wasn't afraid, but there was a certain familiarity in the way she responded to the biker's presence. She had seen this before. The lead biker, a tall, muscular man with a deep scar running down his cheek, stopped a few feet away from Lisa. His leather jacket had patches sewn onto it, the most prominent one reading, "Iron Vultures." The other bikers fanned out slightly behind him, forming a loose semicircle around the volunteers. John kept his stance relaxed but ready. He had dealt with guys like this before, the type who thrived on intimidation, the type who thought they owned the world simply because no one had stood up to them yet. The lead biker pulled off his sunglasses, revealing piercing blue eyes that locked onto Lisa. A slow, cruel smirk spread across his face. "Well, well, well," he drawled, his voice gravelly. "Look who we have here. The little cleanup crew. Back at it again, huh?" Lisa met his gaze steadily. "Someone has to pick up the trash." The biker let out a laugh, and the others joined in, their laughter echoing through the park. One of them, a man with a thick beard and tattoos covering his arms, stepped forward and kicked over a bag of collected garbage. The contents spilled onto the pavement. "Oops," he said mockingly. "Guess you'll have to pick that up too." John felt his jaw tighten. He glanced around at the other volunteers. Some of them looked nervous, shifting their weight uncomfortably. A few others were frozen, staring at the bikers with thinly veiled fear. Lisa, however, remained composed. She slowly set down her grabber tool and folded her hands in her lap. "Is there something you need, or are you just here to make a mess?" The leader crouched slightly, bringing himself eye level with her. His smirk widened. "Oh, we're just enjoying the view. You know, it's kind of funny." He looked back at his men. "A bunch of losers waking up early just to pick up after other losers. It's like some kind of charity for the hopeless." One of the bikers chuckled. "Yeah, real inspiring. Maybe we should start our own volunteer group. Call it the Lost Causes." John felt his muscles tense, but he stayed silent, watching. He wanted to see how Lisa would handle this before stepping in. She had a fire in her, that much was clear. Lisa tilted her head slightly. "Is that why you're here? You looking to sign up? Because we're always happy to have more hands." The bikers erupted in laughter again, but this time there was an edge of irritation beneath it. The leader stood up straight, his expression hardening. "You got a smart mouth, don't you?" Lisa didn't blink. "Maybe, but at least I use it for something other than spitting out garbage." A murmur passed through the volunteers. Some of them looked at Lisa with admiration, others with concern. She had just thrown down a challenge, and they all knew it. The leader's smirk vanished. He stepped even closer, looming over her. "You know, I don't think I like your attitude." John shifted slightly, his instincts kicking in. He was ready to move if things escalated. One of the bikers suddenly picked up a handful of trash from the ground and tossed it at Lisa's lap. Crumpled wrappers and plastic bottles scattered across her legs. "There," the bearded one sneered. "Since you like picking up garbage so much, why don't you start with yourself?" Lisa remained still. A single piece of paper slid off her lap and landed at her feet. She took a slow breath, then looked up. "Pick that up?" The leader barked out a laugh. "What was that?" Lisa's voice remained steady. "You made the mess, pick it up." The amusement in the bikers' faces started to fade. A flicker of annoyance crossed the leader's expression. He wasn't used to being told what to do, especially not by someone like Lisa. John could feel the shift. The bikers had come expecting an easy target, but Lisa wasn't playing along. That frustrated them, and frustration could easily turn into something worse. The leader rolled his shoulders and cracked his knuckles. "You know, I don't take orders from people like you." Lisa lifted an eyebrow. "People like me?" The bearded biker grinned. "Yeah, you know, a useless cripple." The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. The volunteers froze, their faces pale with shock. Lisa's hands clenched around the armrests of her wheelchair, but her face didn't twist in pain or anger. Instead, she let out a quiet laugh, short and humorless. "Wow," she said, "that's the best you've got? How original." The leader's jaw tightened. "You got a lot of nerve." Lisa didn't look away. "And you have none." For the first time, the leader didn't have an immediate response. He looked down at her, and for a split second, something flickered in his expression. Something uncertain, something angry. Then, as if trying to reclaim his dominance, he suddenly grabbed the handle of a nearby trash can, lifted it, and with a violent motion, dumped its contents onto Lisa's head. Gasps erupted from the volunteers. A few people instinctively moved forward, but they didn't dare interfere. Lisa sat motionless as the garbage fell over her. Bits of old food, crumpled napkins, empty coffee cups, all of it landed in her lap and tangled in her hair. The smell was putrid, a mix of rotten leftovers and cigarette ashes. For a long, silent moment, nobody spoke. Then Lisa raised her hand, wiped a piece of lettuce off her cheek, and looked back up at the leader. "You done?" Her voice was calm, steady, not a single crack in it. The leader's smirk faltered. John had seen enough. He took a step forward, his presence suddenly impossible to ignore. His shadow fell over the bikers as he came to stand beside Lisa, his expression unreadable. "That's enough," he said, his voice firm. The bikers turned to him, registering him properly for the first time. A couple of them exchanged glances, recognizing him. The leader scoffed, though there was a slight hesitation in his stance now. "What's this? The hero's finally stepping in?" John met his gaze, unmoving. "She told you to pick it up." Silence stretched between them. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The bearded biker chuckled darkly. "Oh, and what if we don't?" John flexed his fingers slightly. His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "Then I'll make you." The leader tilted his head, assessing him. Then, slowly, his lips curled into a grin. "You really want to do this, wrestler boy?" John held his gaze. "If you don't walk away right now, you won't have a choice." The bikers chuckled, but this time it wasn't quite as confident. The leader smirked, taking a step forward. "All right, tough guy, let's see what you got." John exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. This was about to get messy. The tension in the air was suffocating. The laughter and arrogance that the bikers had displayed moments ago had given way to a charged silence, as if the entire park was holding its breath. John Cena stood unmoving, his broad frame casting a long shadow over the leader of the bikers. The man, still smirking, rolled his shoulders as if preparing himself for a fight, but there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. He had likely faced bar brawls before, but he had never gone up against someone like John Cena. Lisa remained seated, her posture rigid but composed. Garbage still clung to her hair and clothes, but she made no effort to wipe it away. Instead, she watched, her expression unreadable. The other volunteers stood frozen, their eyes darting between the bikers and John, uncertain whether they should intervene or step back. The bearded biker took a slow step forward, cracking his knuckles. "Man, this is hilarious. You seriously think you can take all of us?" John's gaze didn't waver. "If I have to." The leader chuckled, shaking his head. "You got a lot of nerve, big guy, but you don't belong here. This isn't some WWE ring where you get to show off for cameras. Out here, we play by real rules." John smirked slightly. "Good, because I don't do fake fights." That was all it took to tip the balance. The bearded biker suddenly lunged, swinging a fist aimed at John's face. John reacted instantly, sidestepping the punch and countering with a swift, calculated movement. He grabbed the biker's extended arm and twisted it sharply, flipping the man over with ease. The biker hit the ground with a loud thud, groaning in pain. The second biker charged right after, trying to take advantage of the moment, but John was faster. He met the attacker with a powerful shoulder block, sending him stumbling backward before delivering a quick right hook to the man's jaw. The biker crumpled to the ground. The leader of the group took a cautious step back, his smirk faltering for the first time. "All right, you want to play rough? Let's see what you got, tough guy." Another biker rushed John from the side, attempting to land a hit with a steel chain wrapped around his knuckles. John ducked, grabbed the biker by the wrist and yanked him forward before slamming him onto the pavement with a textbook German suplex. The impact knocked the wind out of the man, and he groaned as he rolled onto his side, defeated. The remaining two bikers hesitated for a split second before attacking at the same time. John dodged the first strike and countered by grabbing the closest one by the waist. In a powerful display of strength, he lifted the man onto his shoulders before delivering a brutal attitude adjustment, sending the biker crashing to the ground, dazed and motionless. The last biker, standing, threw a desperate punch, which John easily caught in midair. He squeezed the man's fist in his grip, forcing a pained grunt from the biker before delivering a devastating clothesline that sent him flipping backward onto the pavement. The fight had lasted less than a minute, but every single biker was either on the ground groaning in pain or too stunned to move. John took a slow breath, rolling his shoulders as he stepped forward. He crouched next to the leader, who was struggling to sit up. John's voice was calm but firm. "Now pick up the trash." The leader gritted his teeth, breathing heavily. "You think you're some kind of hero?" John didn't respond. He simply stood up, looking around at the mess they had created. The volunteers, who had remained frozen in place, finally exhaled, relief washing over them. Some exchanged amazed glances, others simply stared at the downed bikers in disbelief. Lisa let out a short breath. She adjusted her position in her wheelchair, then looked at John. "Well, that was efficient." John glanced at her, the corner of his mouth twitching slightly. "I tried to be." The leader of the bikers forced himself to his feet, wobbling slightly. His lip was split, and he wiped at it with the back of his hand. His eyes burned with anger, but there was something else there, too. Humiliation. "You think this is over?" he growled. John's expression didn't change. "That depends. Are you gonna pick up the trash?" The leader clenched his jaw. He glanced at his fallen men, realizing they were in no shape to fight anymore. With a slow, begrudging movement, he bent down and picked up the empty soda can that had fallen near Lisa's wheelchair. The volunteers watched in stunned silence as, one by one, the bikers started gathering the garbage they had thrown just moments before. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They had lost. As the last of the trash was picked up, the leader turned toward John. His blue eyes were still filled with hatred, but his smirk had returned, albeit weaker. "You just made some enemies today, Cena. We don't forget." John remained unfazed. "Neither do I." The bikers collected themselves, limping back to their motorcycles. The leader was the last to mount his bike, his glare lingering on John for a long moment before he finally revved the engine and sped off. The others followed, their tires kicking up small clouds of dust as they disappeared from view. A heavy silence remained in their wake. The volunteers slowly turned back to John, their expressions a mixture of awe and disbelief. One of them, an older man, finally spoke. "That was the craziest thing I've ever seen." Another volunteer nodded. "They've been harassing us for months, and you just—" He shook his head, at a loss for words. Lisa, still sitting in the same position, wiped the last bit of trash from her lap before looking at John. There was no awe in her gaze, only quiet appreciation. "I meant what I said earlier," she told him. "You really don't like fake fights." John shrugged. "Never have." Lisa chuckled softly. "Well, you just cleaned up more than the park today." John glanced around at the volunteers, who were starting to smile, their fear replaced by relief. The park felt different now, as if some invisible weight had been lifted. He pulled off his gloves and tossed them into one of the filled trash bags. Then, without missing a beat, he picked up another bag and started tying it shut. Lisa raised an eyebrow. "You're seriously just gonna go back to cleaning?" John looked at her, smiling slightly. "We're not done yet, are we?" Lisa shook her head, a genuine smile spreading across her face. "Guess not." As the volunteers slowly resumed their work, the air felt lighter. The park wasn't just cleaner, it was safer. And for the first time in a long while, the volunteers knew they wouldn't have to look over their shoulders anymore. The morning sun had risen higher, casting long shadows across the park as the volunteers slowly resumed their work. The tension from the confrontation still lingered in the air, but there was a newfound sense of relief among the group. John Cena remained alongside them, moving effortlessly from one task to another, tying up garbage bags, helping carry heavier debris, and ensuring that Lisa and the others had everything they needed to continue. Lisa had brushed off most of the garbage that had been dumped on her, but traces of it still clung to her clothes. Despite that, her posture remained firm, her movements steady as she maneuvered her wheelchair to collect more litter. She wasn't the type to let something like this break her. She had been through worse, and she knew how to handle herself. But still, something about this time felt different. The bikers had always been a problem, but never before had they been physically aggressive. Never before had they actually tried to humiliate her in such a blatant, disgusting way. She looked over at John, who was lifting a fallen wooden signpost from the ground as if it weighed nothing. His presence had changed everything in an instant. He hadn't hesitated, hadn't second-guessed himself. He had just acted, and now the bikers were gone, at least for the moment. She wondered if they would come back. One of the volunteers, a young man named Eric, walked over to Lisa and lowered his voice. "Do you think they'll stay away after this?" Lisa hesitated before responding. "They'll be back," she admitted. "Guys like that don't just let things go, especially after being humiliated like that." Eric sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Great. Just when I thought we'd finally caught a break." Lisa glanced at John, who was now speaking with an older volunteer near one of the park benches. She had no doubt that he was aware of the same thing. The bikers weren't the type to just walk away. They would come back, but next time they might not be so quick to pick a fight they couldn't win. Next time, they might come prepared. As if reading her mind, John turned toward Lisa and walked over. "They're not done," he said simply. Lisa nodded. "I figured." John crouched slightly so he could meet her gaze directly. "How long have they been harassing you?" Lisa exhaled slowly, leaning back in her chair. "A few months, on and off. They used to just ride through the park, making noise, leaving their trash everywhere. Then they started getting more aggressive, throwing things at us, yelling insults, but today was the worst it's ever been." John studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "And no one's done anything?" Lisa let out a dry chuckle. "We've reported them, a few times actually. The cops show up, take a statement, maybe patrol the park for a day or two, and then it's back to the same thing. The bikers know the system. They know how to push just enough without getting themselves in real trouble." John nodded slowly. He had seen it before. People abusing the limits of the law, knowing exactly how far they could go without consequences. It made his blood boil. Eric shifted uncomfortably. "Now they know we're not just going to take it anymore. That's going to make them mad." Lisa turned her gaze back to John. "I appreciate what you did today, but I need you to know that this isn't over." John met her eyes, his expression unwavering. "I know." Lisa studied him carefully. "And you're not just going to walk away, are you?" John smirked slightly. "Not my style." Lisa let out a small laugh. "Yeah, didn't think so." Eric exhaled and shook his head. "Well, I guess if they do come back, at least we have you on our side." John didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood up, glancing around at the volunteers as they continued their work. These were just regular people trying to do something good for their community, and yet they were being treated like nuisances, like targets for men who thought they could do whatever they wanted. He wasn't going to let that happen. After a moment, he spoke. "If they come back, I'll be ready." Lisa nodded, her grip tightening on the armrests of her wheelchair. "So will I." The work continued in relative peace for the next hour. With John's help, they cleared the last of the littered areas, filling the final few garbage bags. The park was cleaner than it had been in weeks. Some of the volunteers started packing up their supplies, getting ready to head home. Lisa was speaking with an older woman near the picnic tables when she suddenly noticed something out of the corner of her eye. A movement, subtle but distinct. A shadow flickering near the tree line. Her stomach twisted. She turned her head slightly, trying to get a better look without being too obvious. The trees provided cover, but she was sure she saw it. A figure standing partially hidden behind a tree, watching them. Her heart pounded. Lisa's first instinct was to ignore it. Maybe it was just some random park goer, someone who had nothing to do with the bikers, but something told her otherwise. She shifted in her chair and rolled toward John. "Hey," she murmured under her breath. John turned his head slightly, catching her expression. His eyes flickered with understanding. "What is it?" Lisa kept her voice low. "We're being watched." John didn't react right away. Instead, he subtly turned his head, his gaze sweeping toward the tree line without making it obvious. A second later, his jaw tightened just slightly. He had seen it too. There, partially obscured by the shadows, was a figure standing still, observing them. John couldn't make out his face, but he didn't need to. He could tell by the stance, the way the figure positioned himself, that this wasn't just some random passerby. It was one of them. Lisa forced a breath through her nose. "I told you they wouldn't let it go." John's expression remained calm, but there was an unmistakable steel in his eyes. He turned back to Lisa. "They're testing us, seeing if we're scared." Lisa smirked. "Joke's on them, then." John glanced back toward the trees, but the figure was gone. Disappeared as quickly as he had appeared, but that didn't mean the threat was gone. If anything, it confirmed what they already knew. The bikers weren't done. John clenched his fists briefly before releasing them. "We'll be ready." Lisa nodded, but deep down, she knew that whatever was coming next wouldn't be as simple as a few thrown insults and a spilled trash can. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The tension lingered in the air long after the shadowy figure had disappeared from the tree line. Lisa tried to shake off the unease settling in her chest, but she knew what she had seen. The bikers weren't finished with them. This was a warning. A reminder that they were still watching, still waiting for an opportunity to strike back. John Cena remained by her side, his eyes scanning the park with a quiet intensity. His posture was relaxed, but Lisa could tell he was on high alert. He had seen this kind of intimidation before. It was a tactic meant to make them afraid, to keep them looking over their shoulders. But John didn't scare easily. The volunteers finished packing up their supplies, chatting in hushed tones as they gathered the last of the garbage bags. Some of them were still riding the high of what had happened earlier, amazed at how John had single-handedly put the bikers in their place. Others, like Eric, were more wary. Eric stepped closer to Lisa and lowered his voice. "Are we just supposed to pretend like everything's fine? Because I don't think they're done messing with us." Lisa exhaled, adjusting her grip on the wheels of her chair. "No, they're not, but we can't let that stop us." Eric looked like he wanted to argue, but John spoke before he could. "They want you to be afraid," he said, his voice calm but firm. "If they see fear, they'll push harder. The second they think you're backing down, they'll make sure you never come back." Lisa nodded. "So, we don't back down." Eric hesitated but finally let out a small breath. "All right, but if they show up again, what then?" John's expression was unreadable. "Then we handle it." The volunteers finished up, and one by one they started leaving. Some gave John grateful nods, others murmured their appreciation as they passed. Lisa watched them go, a small sense of pride swelling in her chest. Despite the intimidation, they weren't running. They weren't giving up on what they had started. John lingered behind, waiting until the last of the group had gone before turning back to Lisa. "Where's your car?" Lisa smirked. "Think I drove my sports car here?" John let out a short chuckle. "You got a ride home?" Lisa nodded. "Yeah, my friend is coming to pick me up. Should be here soon." John glanced around the park once more. The sun was higher now, the morning haze beginning to burn away. The place looked peaceful again, but that didn't mean it was safe. Lisa sighed. "You don't have to stick around, you know." John looked at her and smiled slightly. "Not my style." Lisa shook her head, amused, but didn't argue. She wasn't about to tell John Cena what to do. A few minutes later, a small silver sedan pulled up to the curb. A woman in her 30s stepped out, her short curly hair bouncing as she walked toward them. She was dressed in scrubs, clearly having just finished a shift. "Lisa, you okay?" she asked, glancing between her and John. Lisa nodded. "I'm good. Long morning, but nothing I couldn't handle." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly. "I saw some of the messages in the group chat. Heard about what happened." Her gaze flickered to John. "And I'm guessing you had something to do with how it ended?" John extended his hand. "John." The woman shook it firmly. "Tasha." She gave him a once-over before nodding approvingly. "Yeah, you definitely don't look like the kind of guy that lets people get away with stuff." Lisa smirked. "That's one way to put it." Tasha sighed, glancing toward the park entrance. "You think they're coming back?" Lisa's smile faded slightly. "Yeah, probably." Tasha muttered something under her breath before shaking her head. "You know, sometimes I wish you weren't so damn stubborn." Lisa grinned. "But then I wouldn't be me." Tasha rolled her eyes but didn't argue. She turned to John. "Thanks for looking out for her." John nodded. "I'll keep looking." Tasha gave him a long look before nodding once. "Good." Lisa wheeled herself toward the car, but before getting in, she glanced back at John. "You really planning on sticking around?" John smirked. "Like I said, not my style to walk away." Lisa chuckled and shook her head. "Well then, guess I'll see you around." John watched as the car pulled away, disappearing down the road. He stood there for a moment, his gaze lingering on the now empty park. He knew this wasn't over. The bikers weren't the type to let something like this slide. And when they came back, it wouldn't just be to throw insults. John cracked his knuckles and exhaled slowly. He'd be ready. The day passed without incident, but John Cena knew better than to let his guard down. The bikers weren't finished. He had seen it in their eyes, the way humiliation burned in the leader's expression before he rode off. They weren't the type to take a loss and move on. They would come back, and next time, they wouldn't be so reckless. As the sun dipped below the horizon, John found himself returning to the park. The once lively and bright space was now bathed in dim street lights, the distant hum of the city blending with the occasional rustling of leaves. It was quiet. Too quiet. He wasn't sure what had drawn him back here. Maybe instinct, maybe the nagging feeling that something was coming. Either way, he wasn't going to ignore it. He walked the paved paths, his eyes scanning the shadows, his senses alert to any movement. Then he saw it. Near the same tree line where the figure had been watching earlier, there was now a cluster of motorcycles parked haphazardly along the curb. A few figures lingered nearby, their silhouettes barely visible against the darkness. John slowed his steps, his fists unconsciously clenching at his sides. They were here. The bikers weren't making a scene this time. They weren't revving their engines or stomping around looking for a fight. No, this was different. This was calculated, a silent show of force, a reminder that they weren't going anywhere. John exhaled slowly and stepped forward, his heavy boots crunching against the pavement. The sound was enough to draw attention. A few of the figures turned toward him, their postures shifting. One of them nudged the man standing at the center of the group, the leader. Scarface, as John had mentally started calling him, turned around with a slow smirk. Even in the dim lighting, his blue eyes gleamed with malice. "Well, well," the man drawled, crossing his arms. "Look who came back." John didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch, let the weight of his presence settle over them. He had learned long ago that sometimes the best way to deal with men like this wasn't with words, but with quiet, unwavering confidence. The leader chuckled. "You stalking us, Cena? That's a little creepy." John remained still. "Didn't take you for the type to lurk in the dark." The leader's smirk widened. "Just making sure our park is safe." John narrowed his eyes. "Your park?" "Yeah." The leader gestured around lazily. "See, we were here long before those little do-gooders started playing janitor. This is our turf. Always has been. And now you're messing with that." John exhaled through his nose. "You want me to be scared? That's not going to happen." The bearded biker from earlier stepped forward, his lips still swollen from their last encounter. "Maybe we should remind you why it should." The leader held up a hand, stopping him. He tilted his head, studying John. "You know, I'll give you credit. You're tougher than most. But here's the thing. You might have won earlier, but that was in broad daylight. Right now, no cameras, no audience, just you and us." John's jaw tightened. "So, what's the plan? You jump me? Try to make an example out of me?" The leader took a step closer. "Something like that." John sighed. He had hoped they'd take their loss and walk away, but deep down, he knew better. Some men couldn't stand losing. Some men had to be broken before they understood. He glanced around, mentally noting their positioning. 5 men. All bigger than average, all itching to make up for the embarrassment they had suffered earlier. But size and numbers didn't mean anything if you didn't know how to use them. John rolled his shoulders, his muscles flexing beneath his shirt. "You sure you want to do this?" The leader grinned. "I was hoping you'd say that." The first punch came fast, but not fast enough. John ducked, pivoting smoothly before slamming his fist into the attacker's ribs. A grunt of pain echoed through the night as the biker staggered backward, clutching his side. The second man charged, swinging wildly. John sidestepped, grabbing his wrist and twisting sharply. The biker yelped as his own momentum sent him crashing into the ground. The other 3 hesitated for a split second before all attacking at once. John moved like a machine, precise, efficient, unstoppable. He caught one of them mid-swing, flipping him over his shoulder with a brutal suplex. Another tried to grab him from behind, but John drove his elbow backward, connecting with his jaw. The last biker hesitated, his confidence suddenly shaken. John took advantage of the pause and delivered a devastating clothesline, sending the man sprawling onto the pavement. In less than a minute, they were all on the ground. The leader, who had stayed back the whole time, stared at the scene before him, his smirk finally gone. John took a step toward him. "You done?" Scarface clenched his fist but didn't move. John exhaled. "This is over. Stay away from the volunteers, stay away from Lisa, and stay out of my way." The leader's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Anger, humiliation, maybe even a hint of respect. But he wasn't stupid. He knew he had lost. Without another word, he turned on his heel and walked back toward his bike. The others slowly picked themselves up, groaning in pain as they followed. John watched as they mounted their motorcycles, engines roaring to life. The leader cast one last glance over his shoulder. "This ain't over." John didn't blink. "Yeah, it is." Scarface sneered before revving his engine and peeling off into the night. The others followed, disappearing into the darkness. John stood there for a long moment, listening to the distant echo of their departure. He wasn't naive. He knew men like that didn't change overnight, but he had sent a message. And for now, that was enough. As he turned and walked back through the park, he pulled out his phone. He had one call to make. Lisa picked up on the third ring. "Knew you'd call," she said. John smirked. "Had a little run-in. Nothing I couldn't handle." Lisa was silent for a moment before she spoke again. "They'll be back." "Maybe," John admitted, "but next time they won't be the ones setting the rules." Lisa let out a small, knowing laugh. "Guess I'll see you tomorrow." John nodded to himself. "Yeah, see you tomorrow." He hung up, slipping his phone back into his pocket as he continued walking. The night was quiet again. For now. The following morning, John Cena arrived at the park before sunrise. The air was crisp, the sky a deep shade of indigo just before the first rays of light would break over the horizon. The events of the previous night replayed in his mind, but his focus remained forward. He wasn't waiting for trouble, he was preparing for it. Lisa arrived shortly after, rolling up the sidewalk in her wheelchair with a calm but focused expression. She wasn't surprised to see John already there. She had expected it. She smirked slightly. "Early morning training session?" John nodded. "Something like that." Lisa exhaled and glanced around. The park was peaceful, but they both knew it wouldn't stay that way. Any sign of them? Not yet. John scanned the empty pathways. But they will come. Lisa didn't argue. She had dealt with bullies before, the kind that wouldn't accept defeat, the kind that thrived on intimidation. The bikers had already shown they weren't going to just walk away from this. They would come back. The only question was when. Other volunteers began arriving, some looking around warily as they set up for the day's work. The tension from yesterday hadn't completely faded. They had seen what happened. They had seen John take down the bikers with his bare hands, but they also knew that wasn't the end of it. Some looked to him now, as if silently seeking reassurance. John spoke calmly. "You all came back. That means something." Eric, who had been unusually quiet, finally let out a breath. "Yeah, well, we figured if you weren't running, neither were we." Lisa smirked. "We're a stubborn bunch." John nodded approvingly. "Good." They got to work. It felt different today. The usual chatter was replaced with a quiet determination. The volunteers weren't just cleaning up a park anymore. They were standing their ground. Every piece of trash picked up, every bag filled, was an act of defiance. An hour passed, then 2. The morning sun rose higher, and for a while it seemed as though things might stay quiet. Then came the sound they had all been dreading. Engines. Loud, rumbling, rolling in like a storm. The volunteers froze. Lisa's hands tightened around her wheels. John straightened, his expression unreadable, his muscles tensing as the motorcycles pulled up at the park entrance. There were more of them this time, at least 10 bikes, maybe more. Scarface was at the front, his face unreadable behind dark sunglasses. His men dismounted, moving with a slow, deliberate confidence. John stepped forward before anyone else could react. He met Scarface's gaze directly. "You don't know when to quit, do you?" Scarface smirked. "Neither do you." Lisa wheeled up beside John. "Let me guess. You're here to check on the park again?" Scarface's smirk widened. "Something like that." He looked around at the volunteers, then back at John. "Word has been spreading. People talking about how you took down my boys last time. See, I can't let that stand." John didn't blink. "Sounds like a personal problem." Scarface's grin faded. "It's about respect." His voice lowered. "And you disrespected us." John took a slow breath. He had been expecting this. He knew men like Scarface wouldn't just walk away. They had fragile egos, and losing wasn't something they handled well. Scarface gestured lazily to his men. "Now, we could do this the hard way. You know, round 2, or—" He glanced at Lisa, then back at the volunteers. "You could tell these people to leave. Stop coming back here. Let things go back to how they were. No more trouble." Lisa let out a sharp laugh. "That's cute. You think you scare us?" Scarface's expression darkened. "I think you should take a hint, sweetheart." John's jaw clenched. "She's not the one who needs to take a hint." Scarface tilted his head. "That's so?" John stepped forward. "I told you yesterday. This is over. You're not in charge here." Scarface exhaled through his nose, his fingers twitching at his side. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't a fight you can win every time. We own this place. We decide what happens here." John's voice was steady. "Not anymore." A flicker of something, anger, frustration, flashed in Scarface's eyes. He took a step closer. "You're real confident, aren't you?" John didn't move. "Yeah." The air was thick with tension. The other bikers were shifting slightly, some waiting for a command, others watching warily. They weren't sure if they wanted to go through another fight. Some of them had felt what it was like to go up against John before, and they hadn't forgotten. Scarface's jaw tightened. He could feel it too. The balance had shifted. John didn't need to throw a punch this time. He had already won. Scarface let out a slow breath and took a step back. He glanced at his men, then at John. "This ain't over." John's expression remained unreadable. "Yeah, it is." Scarface lingered for a moment longer, as if waiting for John to flinch. He never did. Finally, Scarface turned and walked back to his bike. His men hesitated, but when he revved his engine, they followed. One by one, the motorcycles roared to life. One by one, they rode away. The volunteers stood in stunned silence as the last of the bikers disappeared down the road. Tension slowly ebbed away, replaced by something else. Relief. Lisa exhaled. "Well, that was anticlimactic." John smirked. "Sometimes winning means not fighting." Eric let out a breath. "So, that's it?" John watched the empty road for a moment before nodding. "Yeah." Lisa rolled her shoulders. "Huh, kinda wanted to see you throw someone again." John chuckled. "Maybe next time." The volunteers laughed, the nervous energy melting away. The park felt different now, lighter. For the first time in months, they weren't looking over their shoulders. They had won. Lisa looked at John, something unreadable in her expression. "You know, you didn't have to do any of this." John shrugged. Not my style to walk away. Lisa smiled. Good, because we're not going anywhere either. John nodded. Then let's finish cleaning up. Lisa laughed. You just fought off a gang of bikers and your first thought is to pick up more trash? John grinned. It's not going to pick itself up. Lisa shook her head, but she was smiling. The volunteers went back to work, and for the first time in a long time, the park belonged to them again. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden hue over the park as the last of the volunteers finished up their work. The day had been long, but for the first time in months, there was no sense of dread hanging over them, no bikers watching from a distance, no threats lingering in the air. The park felt like it was theirs again. The victory wasn't just in words, it was in the newfound sense of security that had settled over the group. John Cena stood near one of the picnic tables, tying up the last bag of collected trash. His hands were steady, his expression unreadable, but Lisa could tell he was satisfied. He had done what he came to do. More than that, he had helped change something. Not just for her, not just for the volunteers, but for the entire community. Lisa rolled up beside him, shaking her head as she wiped her hands on her jeans. You know, if I didn't know any better, I'd think you actually enjoyed this. John smirked. Not the worst way to spend a day. Lisa exhaled, looking around the park. It looked clean, peaceful. You think they'll come back? John considered the question for a moment before shaking his head. Not after today. Lisa let out a slow breath. Good. The other volunteers started gathering their things, saying their goodbyes, sharing relieved smiles. There was still some uncertainty, still the remnants of fear, but it was fading. They had stood their ground, and now they knew they could. Eric walked over, nodding at John. So, I don't think we ever said it officially, but thanks. John met his gaze. You didn't need me to do this. You just needed a reminder that you could. Eric chuckled. Yeah, well, it helps having a human wrecking ball on our side. Lisa laughed. He's got a point. John smirked. I'll take it. Tasha arrived a few minutes later to pick Lisa up, her eyes scanning the park as if making sure everything was truly over. She exchanged a glance with John before nodding slightly. Looks like you handled it. John simply nodded back. Lisa wheeled toward the car, but paused before getting in. She turned back to John, studying him for a long moment. You really just showed up, wrecked some bikers, saved a community park, and now you're just going to walk away. John shrugged. Not my park. Lisa smiled. Maybe not, but I think you earned yourself a spot here. John met her gaze. You don't need me anymore. Lisa raised an eyebrow. Maybe not, but that doesn't mean we don't want you around. John let the words sit for a moment before nodding. Then, I guess I'll see you around. Lisa smirked. Yeah, see you around, Cena. She got into the car and Tasha drove off, leaving John standing in the quiet park. The last of the volunteers had gone, the sun dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the pathways. John looked around one last time. The park was clean, safe, the way it was supposed to be. He took a slow breath, then turned and walked away, his footsteps steady, his work here done. For now. Justice doesn't always come easy, but sometimes all it takes is one person to remind others that fear is not an option. Today, a lesson was learned, but will it last? What would you do in this situation? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe in standing up for what's right, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. More powerful stories are coming soon.